Welcome back to Forgotten Ties, where every shadow holds a story, and the past is never truly buried. Today, we delve into a tale that began with a simple act of homeownership, but quickly twisted into a spiral of dread and forgotten history. This is the story of Elias, a man whose life seemed so perfectly normal until he disturbed the very ground beneath his feet. Elias wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. He was an architect, methodical and grounded, someone who believed in blueprints and solid foundations. He had just bought his dream home, a quaint, two-story house in rural New Hampshire, with a sprawling backyard framed by ancient oaks, the kind of place you see in postcards, where you can imagine children running and dogs playing. He saw it as his fresh start after a particularly nasty divorce, a place to rebuild not just a life, but a sense of peace. He spent weeks meticulously planning his garden, drawing out beds for hydrangeas and a small vegetable patch. He was a man with a plan. But the earth, it seems, had other ideas. He started with the old stone wall at the very back of the property, a crumbling line of rock that he wanted to reinforce. As he worked, he noticed something odd. Buried just beneath the moss and loose soil was a piece of slate, unnaturally smooth and flat. He assumed it was just a misplaced paving stone, perhaps left behind by a previous owner. But as he dug deeper, he saw more of it, a rectangular shape emerging from the dirt. He called his golden retriever Winston, who happily pawed at the soil, his tail wagging as if he was in on the joke. Elias knelt down, scraping away the last of the grime with his trowel, and then he froze. It wasn't a paving stone. It was a headstone, weathered and stained with age, but unmistakable. He traced his fingers over the carved letters. The name was so faded he had to squint to make it out. Eleanor Vance. And below it, a date. Not a birth and death date, but just one single year, 1892. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Who was Eleanor Vance? And why was she buried in his backyard? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a pet, he thought, a beloved dog or cat. But the stone was too formal, too starkly human in its design. The air around him suddenly felt different, heavier. The postcard-perfect yard now felt like a secret, a tomb. He wiped his hand on his jeans, but the feeling of the cold stone lingered. He spent the rest of the day digging, the careful architect now a frantic archaeologist. He didn't find a coffin, or a body, or any other markers. Just that single stone standing silent guard over a patch of grass. The house, which had been his sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. That night he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the trees, felt like a footstep. A whisper. He was no longer alone in his home. He had unknowingly become the keeper of a grave, the unwilling confidant of a secret that had been buried for over a century. And the real question wasn't who Eleanor Vance was, but why her grave was hidden from the world. Why her family, whoever they were, had chosen to bury her in the back of a private property, rather than in consecrated ground. It was a question that would drive him down a path of obsession, a path that led not to peace, but to something far more sinister. Elias's meticulous nature, which once gave him comfort, now became his torment. He couldn't let go of the name Eleanor Vance. The discovery of the headstone was no longer just a weird anecdote. It was a nagging whisper, a historical mystery that had chosen him as its only witness. He started spending his evenings hunched over his laptop, not for work, but for research. He scoured online genealogical records, local historical archives, and old newspaper clippings from the 1890s. The town library, a dusty, quiet place he had never visited, became his second home. The librarian, a woman named Martha with a knowing look in her eye, seemed to understand his obsession even before he explained it. "People come here looking for things," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes they find more than they bargained for." He found nothing about an Eleanor Vance who had died in 1892. No obituaries, no death certificates, no mention in any census records. It was as if she had never existed. But the stone, the cold, tangible proof, was right there in his backyard. It was a contradiction that drove him to a breaking point. The more he searched, the more the silence screamed. One afternoon, while sifting through Old Town records, he stumbled upon a ledger from a local church, an old leather-bound book with faded script. It was a baptismal record. He painstakingly flipped through the pages until he found a single solitary entry for the year 1892. Not for a child, but a woman. The name was Eleanor Vance. The record was simple: baptized on July 10, 1892. And then, a single word scrawled in a different, more panicked hand, almost as an afterthought: purged. Purged. What did that mean? The word felt like a physical blow. It was a word of cleansing, of removal, of violent erasure. He went to the church, a small, unassuming stone building, and spoke to the current pastor. The pastor, a young, nervous man, listened to Elias's story with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had heard whispers of the church's past, of secrets buried so deep they were almost forgotten. He confirmed that the old records were notoriously incomplete, but the word purged was an anomaly. It's not a word we use, he stammered. Not for a person. It's used for something unclean, like a spirit or a cursed object. The fear that had been a quiet hum in Elias's mind now became a sharp, ringing alarm. He wasn't just dealing with a historical mystery. He was dealing with something horrifying, an unholy secret. He began to see the house differently. The way the light hit the windows felt like a glare. The silence felt like a presence. He swore he heard a child's laughter in the middle of the night, a high, ghostly sound that seemed to come from the very spot where the tombstone lay. He started to have nightmares, dreams of a girl with a face he couldn't see, reaching out to him from a dark, muddy hole. He knew he had to dig again, not for peace but for answers. He couldn't live with this weight anymore. He went back to the yard, the spot where the stone stood like a sentry. He dug, his hands raw and blistered, the earth fighting him every inch of the way. And that's when his shovel hit something solid, not stone, but wood. A box. A small, splintered box, sealed with iron bands. As he pried it open, the stench of decay and something else, something sickly sweet and cloying, filled the air. Inside, nestled on a bed of rotted silk, was a small porcelain doll. Its eyes, painted a disturbing shade of blue, seemed to stare up at him. And clutched in its tiny porcelain hand was a locket. He felt a wave of nausea, a primal horror that had nothing to do with logic or reason. He had not just disturbed a grave. He had awakened something that wanted to be forgotten. But he was now part of its story, and there was no turning back. The moment Elias saw the doll's unblinking eyes and the locket clutched in its hand, he knew this was no ordinary grave. This was a grave meant to be a prison. The air, heavy with the scent of decay, seemed to press in on him. He scrambled out of the hole, the porcelain doll a chilling weight in his hands, and staggered back to the house. He placed the doll on a workbench in the garage, a stark, lifeless thing against the backdrop of his tidy tools. The locket, a tarnished silver heart, felt impossibly cold. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers trembling, and managed to pry it open. Inside, there were two small, faded photographs. One was a young woman, no older than 20, with a kind but sorrowful face. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple, dark dress. She was beautiful, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes, a look of profound loss. The other photo was of a child, a little girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with wispy blonde curls and those same disturbing, wide blue eyes as the doll. But it was the child's face that sent a shiver down his spine. It was her eyes. They weren't just blue. They were pale, almost translucent, with a strange, unnatural shine. And the smile, a forced, unsettling rictus, didn't reach them. Elias stared at the photos, a sick feeling building in his gut. The woman, he was almost certain, was Eleanor Vance. And the child was a ghost, a presence that he could feel standing just behind him. He looked back at the doll. The resemblance was uncanny, a grim caricature. He knew, with a certainty that transcended all logic, that the doll wasn't a toy. It was a vessel, a gruesome, desperate attempt to contain something, and the locket was the key. He looked at the doll's unnerving smile and the little girl's haunting, empty eyes in the photo, and he was overwhelmed by a sense of profound pity, followed by an equally profound terror. He went back to his research, but this time he wasn't looking for Eleanor Vance. He was looking for a family. He found a land record from 1891, the year before the gravestone date. His property, had belonged to a family named Vance. The name of the man was Silas Vance, and his wife was Agnes Vance. There was no mention of a child, and there was no mention of an Eleanor. But an old town clerk's diary, found in the Historical Society's archives, offered a horrifying clue. An entry from July 1892, written in a shaky, almost unreadable hand, spoke of the Vance child. The entry read, "Silas and Agnes lost their little one. They claim it was a fever. But the eyes, I have never seen such eyes. They were not human. A curse on this house. A curse on all of them. They buried her in the yard to hide their shame, to hide the abomination." The name of the child was never written, but the diary entry confirmed it. The tombstone was for a child, cursed child. A child whose existence was so monstrous that her parents buried her in secret and wiped her from the records. But who was Eleanor Vance, the woman in the locket? Elias's mind reeled. He held the locket, the cold metal a stark contrast to his feverish thoughts. He looked at the photo of Eleanor and the child. They were clearly mother and daughter. But why would Eleanor be baptized just before her death? And why was her name on the headstone meant for the child? And what was this curse the clerk wrote about? He felt the dread creeping into his very bones. This wasn't a simple, tragic story of a family burying their child in secret. This was a story of a lie, of a horrifying truth hidden behind a facade of piety. The doll, the locket, the grave in the backyard. They were all parts of a puzzle, and Elias was holding the last, most terrifying piece. He had to know the full truth. He had to know what really happened to Eleanor Vance and her child. And he had a terrible, sinking feeling that the truth would break him, just as it had broken them. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. A distant relative of the Vance family, a reclusive old man who still lived in a nearby town, agreed to meet Elias. He was frail, his memory a collection of fragments, but his eyes held the weight of an inherited terror. He had been told the story in hushed tones as a child, a story passed down through generations like a poisoned inheritance. He spoke of a curse, a bloodline corrupted by a dark pact. Agnes Vance, the child's grandmother, had been a woman of powerful but unholy magic. She had performed a ritual to save her family's farm from ruin, a ritual that had worked, but at a terrible, unforeseen cost. The firstborn child of every successive generation was to be a vessel for the ancient, malevolent spirit she had summoned. The child with the unnaturally pale eyes was born to Eleanor, Silas's daughter, as a result of that curse. Her name was not a name but a number, a placeholder for a horror, and the child's purpose was not to live, but to contain. When the child was born, the family knew what she was. A monster in human form, a host for a demon. The fever was a lie to hide the truth. They tried everything to exorcise the entity, to save their daughter, but nothing worked. Finally, in a desperate, final act, Silas and Agnes devised a terrible plan. They would kill the child and trap the spirit inside a vessel, the porcelain doll. But a life had to be sacrificed to seal the binding. It was a choice between Eleanor, who was now a pariah, a woman tainted by the demonic birth, and Agnes, the one who had brought the curse upon them. Eleanor, a woman broken by grief and guilt, chose to save her mother. She offered her own life, her own soul, to be the final lock on the vessel. Her baptism, the old man explained, wasn't an act of faith, but a desperate, final plea for grace before the ultimate sacrifice. And her name was etched on the tombstone, not as a mark of respect, but as a perpetual reminder of the binding. Her blood, mixed with her name on the stone, was to be a seal that Elias, with his innocent digging, had just broken. The story was over. But the legacy was just beginning. The reclusive relative gave Elias a final, chilling piece of advice. You've awakened it. You've broken the seal. It will follow you. You are its new keeper. You must get rid of the house. You must destroy the doll. You must run and never look back. Elias returned to his home. His sanctuary was now a crypt. The doll, sitting on his workbench, seemed to mock him with its painted smile. He looked at the headstone in his backyard, no longer a relic of the past, but an active, unholy thing. He was the one who had disturbed it, and now he was the one who was bound to it. He was no longer a man seeking a peaceful life. He was a man running from his own home, a man haunted by a century-old curse. And that, my friends, is the terrifying story of Elias and the secret family tombstone. But the truly chilling part? We don't know what happened to him. The last contact anyone had with him was a cryptic email. He had sold the house for a pittance to a new, unsuspecting couple. And in the email he simply wrote, "I'm running, but I don't think I can ever outrun a forgotten ghost." If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, if the hair on the back of your neck stood up, then you know what to do. Give this video a like, because every like helps us shine a light on the darkest corners of history. Subscribe to Forgotten Ties so you never miss a new story. And be sure to turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the next terrifying tale drops. Until then, remember, some secrets are buried for a reason, and some whispers are best left unheard.